Hello and welcome back for my walk with my wolf. Not my wolf still, just a dog that I walk with 30% wolf genes. Right, today we're on the iPhone, and we will be talking about being neutral. So I think if you're into like the personal development space, then you'll probably heard of stoicism and like being stoic, being calm. If somebody else can alter you internally, then you give them the power over you. And I've heard that like years ago, and yeah, it did resonate. However, I think there's another layer that kind of came to it over the last year that I'm kind of prioritizing in terms of stepping more into that, embodying that, because I think it's a very helpful way also in terms of manifestation. And yeah, basically I think like not even in terms of qualifying it against other ways of being, but in terms of I think a good way of being, especially in times like this, where I think it's a transformational year. I think literally the numerology of this year is about transformation. So astrology is interesting, which astrology is always interesting, but yeah. So basically in Stoicism, it's very much the same idea than the one that I'm going to be talking about more today, about, if you, like being the calm, like just being stoic regardless of what happens, basically, and not letting your thoughts and emotions run you instead of being they would say stoic. In terms of like the spiritual manifestation perspective, I think this analogy that I heard in one book, I don't remember which one, I'm sure it's probably not only mentioned there, that there was this farmer and he had a horse, and one day his horse ran away, and the neighbors were saying, "Oh no, your horse ran away, aren't you so sad?" And he was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then the horse came back a week later with another wild horse. They were like, "Wow, like you got 2 horses now. Aren't you so happy?" And he's like, "Yeah, maybe." And then they're trying to break in that wild horse, and his son falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And then the neighbors are like, "Oh, that's such a shame. Aren't you like, doesn't this upset you? Like, isn't this a shame?" Kind of. And he's like, "Yeah, maybe." And then the next week, military, I guess recruiters, that's not what it's called, come by to draft the young man into war. And they go to his son, and his son can't go because his foot is broken. And the neighbors go like, "Aren't you so glad?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, maybe." So instead of, and in spirituality, it's kind of connected to the idea of, if you want to know more about this, I think Nero right now, there's much more recommendations, but he kind of talks about all these things in a relatively simple way. There's the concept of duality, and there's the concept, obviously, of like the world that we live in terms of like the reality that we experience through our senses, through our awareness, and that's like, say, the 3D. So that's basically everything that we think is real because it appears as real to us. And in that world, everything exists like on a kind of like a sliding spectrum. So like light and dark is part of the same thing, and it's just like expression of the same thing, like a difference, a contrast of the same thing. And same, for example, with cold and warm. Okay, we're standing. With cold and warm, it's there's no specific point on the thermostat where it says that, okay, from here it goes cold, from here it goes warm. It's just part of the spectrum of temperature in that case. So we experience this reality in terms of duality, in terms of good and bad, in terms of all these kind of things that we're pulled between. So as much as I like the idea of Stoics, to me it's not as intuitive or as applicable. I'm sure it maybe has been then, but it's like lightly raining. It's not as intuitive as the idea of being neutral. So if you allow something to the degree that you allow something to internally shift you to the quote unquote good, is the degree that you allow some to be shifted to the bad, quote unquote. So let me get back to. So this is not an argument around if good or bad exists. I think especially a lot of religions, obviously, and even outside of religions, there's very much, I think, this consensus in a lot of people that good and evil kind of exist. And I'm not here to argue that. I guess from my understanding, as I understand it now, which can change, it's part of the same thing. And inherently the belief that good and evil exists, or like that bad things happen to good people, for example, or the inherent belief of karma or whatever. Like, I'm also not here to argue karma. I recently met somebody because I was watching Neo's video, and as a spiritual person, I very much believed in karma, and I've learned about karma in the last years, or just thought about it. Sorry, I keep messing with the screen. And I was thinking, obviously that makes sense, and like it's a nice concept in terms of if you're good, then you're getting good back. And I'm, like I said, not here to argue. I think in many ways that's true. If you're focusing on the good, then you receive more good. And I'm not even saying that just because good and bad is part of the same spectrum, that one side doesn't exist. It's just an expression of the same thing. So anyways, what was my point there? Let me quickly think about it. So we talked about neutrality. We talked about being calm. We talked about why. Basically, the point is that you yourself can't know why something is happening for you or to you or whatever. I would say genuinely for you, but I understand that's not necessarily universal, depending on the beliefs you hold and how you experience life. But anyways, in terms of this dualism, in terms of this illusion of separation, or of dualism that we experience, in spiritual concept, I think that's also, like, you kind of need that dualism for karma. But in terms of the spiritual concept, that is kind of above that. The idea of non-dualism, that yes, as we experience things, they appear to be dualistic, they appear separate. However, in deeper spiritual reality, everything is one. Everything is an expression of that one. And what I recently had, well, this is kind of going a little bit off topic, but I think it's an interesting point to kind of conceptualize the spiritual idea of, like, why are we then conscious, and what does it mean if it's not just us conscious, but if consciousness is all around us, if it's like a web of consciousness. Then I've thought about this before in terms of why are we here? Or like, why are we experiencing this? Why do we, I guess, suffer with our consciousness? And why are we experiencing it? Say if there's not, like, there's a creative force, there's a universe, there's a God in that sense, but it didn't necessarily create or end anything. It's just, in the Kybalion, I would say, like, the all. So there's nothing to be gained or there's nothing to be lost for it because it's in everything. So why would that then exist? Well, because as humans, you can imagine, we get to know ourselves, and whether that's through experiences, whether that's more of an intellectual pursuit, whether that's more of a, I don't know, mental pursuit, doesn't matter. Ow, bitch. Sorry. You know, in life, we go from one level of understanding of ourselves to a deeper level, to a deeper level. And even if people don't set it out for themselves at all, to, I don't know, to learn or whatever, this is kind of what we're doing, right? This is a process of self-understanding. So, technically, the universe, the all, the whatever, is doing the exact same thing by experiencing itself through consciousness. And we're just one of those expressions. Now, you could say, because of our senses and because of what we believe, what we understand to be true, that we are the pinnacle of. However, it doesn't seem necessarily to me obvious that this is the end all be all and that this can be proven in any way, shape or form. I think in terms of the things that we perceive, for example, nice, the bats, that are so limited in terms of like sight, for example, we only perceive like 0.03% of the light spectrum. To me, it's not obvious at all that just because we have this limited sensory perception, that because we appear within that to be the pinnacle of evolution, that we are. I would disagree with that, especially in terms of the timeline of being said that it's a linear growth. Nothing usually in nature seems to be linear growth. It's always cyclical. And being curious about ancient civilizations and even like some of the origins of religion and stuff. It's like fully speculative. I don't claim to have any superior insight or understanding, but to me it seems quite obvious that we're on a cyclical. I do think we're on an upswing, which is great, because for a few years there I was a little bit pessimistic, but I don't think so anymore. But yeah, in terms of being neutral, I took you on that little side tangent of the universe, doesn't matter. I'm sure I had a point with that. If I will remember, then I will bring it up here. But in terms of being neutral, I think the good thing about being neutral, first of all, it doesn't mean that you don't get to enjoy or appreciate or be grateful for the good things that happen to you. And it doesn't mean that you don't get to experience or like validate your feelings or whatever, be present in the moments that are more contrast. I don't like to use problems. I think language is extremely powerful. Language is also like a way of programming the subconscious mind. So that's another side note in terms of how do you use language. So I don't want to say if you have problems, like no, problems just exist and you experience them. Same way with thoughts. You don't have a thought, you just experience a thought and usually it passes. So if you're trying to maintain neutrality and you're trying not to let yourself be swayed on this emotional roller coaster between good and bad, which is what I'm working on, you can still be grateful. In fact, gratitude is like a really powerful thing, and you can still acknowledge the contrast that you experience. Contrast instead of problems, okay? It's all contrast. It's all part of the same thing. That's where the unity idea comes in. Then just realize that bad things are temporary, resistance is always temporary. On a more practical level, you could think that, as a reminder, like how often do you have a shit day, or like a shit, I don't know, 1 hour of the day, and the next day you're thinking back, you're like, oh, this was so shit, like I felt so shit then, you know. Like typically that doesn't happen. So kind of reframing resistance as temporary anyways, and being neutral about it. So even also from Neuro Knowledge, another interesting video, if you struggle with attachments, addictions, etc., etc. His video on addictions talks about this also really nicely. Neutrality is a really powerful tool also to take yourself, out of addictions, out of bad attachments, or just in general attachments, out of limiting beliefs, out of all kinds of things that you think no longer serve you or you want to let go of. Then using neutrality. So for example, just briefly to summarize, he talks about it in way more detail. Let me wipe you again. Sorry. Sorry, this dog sometimes is pulling, so if I'm a little bit out of breath, but it's fine. So what he talks about very much, in a very brief, concise, summarized version, is if you're, for example, trying to stop drinking alcohol and, it's not necessarily like a straightforward, you just stop and it's just like you never touch it again kind of process. When you do give into it again and you do drink again, instead of beating yourself up, like the addiction, the attachment to why you're doing that, the void that kind of is underlying to why you are engaged in that behavior anyways, kind of feeds off the energy that you pour into it. So if you're able to stay neutral and be like, and just be present, or I think present is such a wishy-washy term, at least to me it is, but I would say just be neutral. Like don't judge yourself, don't reward yourself when you're doing good, just being neutral. And even if you're giving in, even if you're being successful, try to stay in that place of not emotionally charging either way, because it's like a pendulum. If you're emotionally charged in a good way, for example, or if you're really high on life in the good times or whatever, then you create this swing to the one side of the pendulum, and by doing that you also create the ability, and pretty much, by nature, the swing to the other side of the pendulum. So this helped me understand why so many spiritual people seem so similar in terms of their vibe, how they come across, in terms of how they speak. This very calm, this very if you want to judge it from a lower consciousness, it's very kind of dull, boring, but in a good way, but they seem like they have less personality, or not even less personality, that's maybe very reaching, but more in terms of that their demeanor is very similar to each other, I think, in general. And whether they are mad, or whether something happens that upsets them or whatever, or something happens that's great, it seems like they don't really experience much of the swings. And I don't know, I think I kind of intuitively admire that, and at the same time, I don't know if it gave me a feeling of inferiority, subconsciously, not that I thought that, but in terms of why I judged them for being boring, for example, in my head, not being you're so boring, and but more my perception now that I'm reflecting on it. But yeah, in terms of the deeper understanding that I think I've gathered now, I understand that in many ways neutrality should be the goal, understanding that you're whole, understanding that – same way that humans are mostly good, and that I think understanding that even if you're experiencing contrast, if you're experiencing resistance, it's serving you, and experience is mostly, yeah, this kind of contradicts what I said before. I wanted to say it's mostly good, but then at the same time, obviously, that's coming from a place of duality. So maybe there's just something more for me to learn right there, why I expressed it there like this. Like, obviously, we can't live in full non-duality. We are here in this experience, but in terms of if we can put ourselves energetically in that understanding of non-duality and learn to embody that, I think it's very, very beneficial, and certainly a little bit my goal for, not just for this year, but for this year to learn how to embody it more. Yeah, I think that's today's video. My hand is cramping a little bit from holding it. I actually came up with another part of this discussion, or this conversation, in terms of how to make it a little bit more understandable. So, for example, we're going to just use politics, because politics are really divisive right now, and everybody thinks they know better, or their view is somehow more right or more good or whatever. And I think that includes most people. It includes, me. I'm working on being neutral on it, but to be honest, everybody has their opinions and their beliefs and how they look at the world, and yeah, that's fine. But anyways, in terms of being neutral and how that applies to it, imagine something XYZ happens, and you'll think, that's good because it happens for my side, or like, that's bad because, I don't know, it's not good for a certain group of people, or I don't know, it's not nice, or whatever it is. All those things are, fine and dandy, but those are all reactions, and those come from inherently judging from that dualistic perspective. So instead of being neutral, you are thinking from the point of perspective that you can judge this. However, understanding that things are infinitely complex. From any given point, any given thing could be happening, in terms of like parallel universes, for example, or also even in terms of, relatively simply, it's relatively easy for humans to understand first order consequences. If you do X, Y might happen. However, it gets like infinitely more complex in terms of second order, third order consequences, things that are extremely difficult to predict. Again, like I said, from that perspective of even have like, I'm not saying that this is the most realistic example, but from if we're living in a universe where parallel universes exist, or like the quantum field where everything is possible from every given point, then you can not know, doesn't matter how educated you are, doesn't know how close you are to it, how opinionated you are, how much you like the one side or you hate the other side, for example. You, with your limited understanding, this I'm just talking about myself very much as well. I also have to remind myself, like, I do still watch a little politics here and there, and I also have the first reaction sometimes to be like, ha ha ha, or like, yay, or like, boo, So instead I try to embody neutrality. I try to remind myself that it's impossible for me to understand what it means for any given thing to happen. This is on a small scale or like on a large scale. Politics is just like, I think, like one of the closer examples because of how inherently not neutral it is at the moment. But yeah, instead of like letting yourself get swayed by this great thing happened, and this shit thing happened, just try to be like, okay, good things happen. Well, we're back in the duality space, but I also didn't mean to say earlier in terms of transcend duality. That doesn't mean duality doesn't exist in this plane that we are in, you know. We do experience warmth and coldness, even if we say it's all just one part of the temperature spectrum, you know. And also your brain is naturally going to kind of go with what it's comfortable with and what it knows and how you've used it in the past. So it's completely natural for you to fall into ways of thinking good and bad. It's just more about choosing your awareness to kind of use it to realize that as much as your reactions are in a certain way trying to categorize things as what they are, in the deeper reality you don't know what they really are. You don't know the instance. You don't know how they are in terms of where they land on a spectrum of existence, of good and bad, or like, you know, what happens because of it. And also, again, to be swayed by one side means you can also be swayed by the opposite side. Instead, I think, especially for times like these, embodying neutrality and just thinking about, you know, either way it goes, this is just how it is. And one thing that kind of helped me in terms of detachment, in terms of letting like my thoughts go when they want to go to that place of like, whether it's not really about politics, this more applies to me in terms of psychology, in terms of, you know, how you think about yourself. But anyways, it doesn't matter, you can use it for this too. When your brain is trying to judge something, or trying to categorize something as one thing or the other, or trying to predict something, or causing some kind of resistance against something, or some attachment towards something, if you want to kind of embody that higher state of non-duality, of just finding like your set point that you're comfortable at, that you're experiencing the feelings that, you know, you most want to experience, for example, peace or security or whatever. If you could embody those and then remind yourself when your mind is going into that state of, for example, overthinking or whatever, remind yourself that thinking about potential outcomes or judging things or trying to categorize things in your mind, or you know, whatever you do that's not serving you, like putting your mental energy into that, trying to quote unquote figure it out, which is an illusion in and of itself, is, to me, metaphorically, I view it the same way as I view about thinking that there's unlimited stars. Okay, it's a nice sentiment, you know, it could be potentially true. I mean, I'm not arguing with that fact or whatever, but it's more like my brain can't conceptualize it because of how large that number is. So to me, it's completely irrelevant in terms of when you're thinking or worrying about the future, or worrying about one outcome over the other, or you're feeling frustrated about one political side or the other. Instead of letting yourself run with it, I've used this just way of thinking, like, if I notice myself doing it, you know, usually that happens within, like, if you started, like within maybe 20 seconds after you started, maybe a minute after, you know, you've gone there in terms of overthinking or whatever, then I remind myself, I would be wasting just as much mental energy if I was thinking right now about conceptualizing infinite stars in the galaxy, because there's infinite possibilities how any given thing can play out. And yeah, you can conceive of certain things, and yeah, you can maybe problem solve and think about certain ways, but to be honest, it's a resistance, it's an attachment, and yeah, if you don't want to live in that, then for me the most helpful thing to let it go was kind of conceptualizing it like counting stars. It's maybe a nice sentiment, maybe not even the worst way of spending your time, but it is futile because you can do all the thinking about it and you will never arrive at any final conclusion. And yeah, that's what's kind of helped me to to let things go in my mind. Yeah, I think this is probably gonna be the last thing actually now. And I'm sorry if the tone quality or visual quality is not so good. It is what it is. Yay, I'll see you in the next one.